Lyra Nightshade learned to kill before she learned to love. Trained by an order that dresses murder in righteousness, she sneaks into the Alpha's fortress as a servant, her hands steady, her oath colder than the moon. When Alpha Tardus claims her at the mating ceremony, the world she was raised to destroy breaks into sharp, unbearable truth. The enemy is not a monster, but the man who will not let her die alone. Bound by blood, hunted by betrayal, and watched by a goddess who keeps score with stars, Lyra must choose between a vow that demands her death and a love that might save the pack, and doom them both. And the moon remembers everything. I learned to kill before I learned to love. The order taught us to pray with the same tongue we use to slit throats. Morning drills were mercy, midnight lessons, execution. We were pledged to one doctrine: remove the monstrous from their thrones so the innocent might breathe. They gave me a name, Lyra Nightshade, and a number under it, a knot of oaths threaded into my blood. The first time an elder pressed the ritual blade to my palm, the cold settled into bone. They called it right. I called it a chain. Belief is a useful weapon. It lets you do things you would never do alone. I learned to wipe blood before I learned to wash my hair. I learned to pass through shadows like a breath, to wear faces: seamstress, scullery hand, laughing girl. We were fed stories: alphas who ate their packs, kings who raised villages. Tardus Duskbane was the name they spat with every caution. I repeated the creed until it became weather. For the order, for the balance. When the assignment came, it arrived like a sealed command. Enter the fortress as a servant. Infiltrate. Make his end look like misfortune. The elder bound a sigil to my wrist, ink that would burn if I broke the oath, and stared as if she could measure my loyalty in the set of my jaw. You will be the shadow in his halls, she said. You will finish what must be finished. I packed my lies into a bundle: a coarse skirt, a headscarf, humility that smelled of starch. My hand trembled only once, when I traced the secret rune they taught us to press into a sleeping throat. I tucked that knowledge into the pocket of myself and closed it up. The fortress received me at dusk. Stone rose around me, patient and ancient, braziers guttering against the coming dark. Voices moved through the corridors, laughter brittle as winter, the scrape of knives. A servant called my name when I stepped over the threshold, unaware that the woman they welcomed carried a blade beneath her apron. Before I could reach the scullery, the air shifted. A presence like gravity adjusted. A silhouette across the hall stopped. Eyes found me with the careful weight of someone counting heartbeats. The betas. He watched without anger, only an attentive suspicion that felt like a net tightening. "You're up late," he said, low enough that no one else might hear. The sigil on my wrist prickled. For a breath, the training and the lies rushed through me like a cold tide. I let the smile fall into place because smiles are small armors, and answered the question that might expose me before I was ready.
The fortress swallowed sound like a throat swallowing a secret. Stone corridors folded into one another. Torchlight trembled on banners stitched with a wolf that wore a crown. Servants moved like a low tide, carrying warmth and waste, gossip and clean linen. I learned each passage, each hinge and hidden stair, like the lines in a palm, so I would always know where to slip away. Days blurred into tasks: stoke the braziers, scour the long tables, stitch torn cloaks. It was humbling work by design. Humility makes a blade easier to hide. The other servants hummed old pack songs, and I matched them with my mouth, but not my heart. I listened to the cooks argue about cuts of meat, watched children practice at the edge of the training yard, and learned the cadence of the fortress: who laughed loudest, who slept with a dagger under the pillow. Those small domestic truths were my camouflage. The beta watched me more often than the others. He carried himself like a man who measured danger in the round, eyes scanning, mind cataloging. When he spoke, he did not linger in conversation. He asked a question and let the silence answer back, searching the space between the words. "Where did you come from before the fortress?" he asked once, standing near the larder. "A small village beyond the North Ridge," I lied, hands steady as I arranged jars of preserved plums. He watched me tuck the seam of my skirt, the habit of someone noting a trait for the day he needed it. "You don't speak like you were born there," he murmured. "You walk like you know the shadows." I let the laugh fall out of me, an effortless sound, practiced, and he accepted it, though his eyes didn't soften. That tightness was a map. I read it and folded it away. It was in the library that the fortress let me breathe without thinking of blades. Books were sacred and left mostly alone. The Alpha trusted few to cross that floor. I dusted the ledgers by day, and at night when the household settled, I lingered, sweeping away the candle's crumbs, running a thumb along bindings. It was how I told myself I was ordinary. One night, behind a loose stone in the hearth, my fingers brushed something thin and smooth. I pried it free, a scrap of leather, folded small, tied with a brittle thread. The scent lifted, earth, smoke, and something softer, almost like cinnamon. Curiosity, a trait drilled out of us at the order by discipline, crept back in anyway. I eased the knot. It was a keepsake, a child's drawing, badly sketched, a wolf with a crooked crown, and beneath it, the name Tardus, scrawled in a furious, uneven hand. Folded in between was a leaf, pressed flat and brittle as old promises. I pressed the leaf to my chest without thinking. The order's litany buzzed like a wasp at the edge of my mind. Monsters, tyrant, end him. The thing in my hand made the words taste false. A sound stopped my breath. Footsteps, soft but heavy with purpose, crossed the corridor outside the door. The beta's silhouette blocked the light a moment, then passed. My heart practiced rebellion against my ribs. I should have hidden the keepsake. I should have replaced the stone, tucked the leather back where it belonged. I did none of those things. Curiosity had already shredded my old loyalties into thin thread. The door to the study opened. He filled the threshold before I could slip away, tall, broad-shouldered, every inch arranged to command. Moonlight caught the line of his jaw. For one stupid, impossible second, I saw the stories I had been fed, the cruel Alpha, the image burned into my head, and then I looked at his hands. They were calloused from work, not cruelty. He closed the distance the way a tide closes a shore. "Who are you?" His voice did not roar. It was closer to a question asked to someone who had wandered into a wrong life. My fingers tightened around the paper, and the room blurred with the weight of the thing I'd found and the weight of the oath inked on my skin. The sigil at my wrist prickled like a living thing. The beta's footsteps paused behind him. Tardus's eyes dropped to my hands. "What is that you hold?"
What is that you hold? The words landed softer than I'd expected. An invitation, not an accusation. For a heartbeat, I forgot to breathe. Training taught me a dozen ways to vanish. A laugh that could fold suspicion into itself. A lowered gaze that made secrets feel ordinary. I summoned them like old tools, practiced and precise, and let my smile come out smooth as steam. "Just a child's doodle," I said, even as my fingers closed tighter around the scrap. The paper crinkled. The leaf inside rasped like a thing that had been waiting to be remembered. "Found it wedged in the hearth." He stepped into the light fully then, and all the horror stories I'd chewed and swallowed for years curdled into the space between us. The Alpha was not a savage carved from nightmare. He was a measure of quiet. Broad-shouldered, yes, but muscles softened by use. A jaw that held decisions like a hand holds a stone. His voice carried weight, not cruelty, the kind of voice that makes rooms straighten without being asked. The beta lingered in the doorway, an island of watchfulness. He watched me the way a hawk watches mice, attentive, hungry, patient. "A servant in the library at this hour?" His tone was the smallest blade. Strange hours for one fated to mend cloaks. My mouth practiced the answer before my heart consented. I couldn't sleep, I said. Books. The silence. The lie fell into the cracks of the floorboards. I'd said worse and meant it less. I thought of the elder's hands, of the sigil burned into my flesh. The rune under my sleeve hummed, a cold, small animal awake. Tardus's eyes never left my hands. He reached for the scrap as if to examine a relic, and when his fingers brushed my knuckles, a current passed through me that had nothing to do with the thing in my palm. He smelled of hearth smoke and iron, of work done with honest hands. For the first time since the order shaped my tongue, the word monster tasted wrong in my mouth. You're in a dangerous place for a woman who keeps secrets, the beta said. He stepped forward now, closer, and I felt the net of his suspicion tighten. Who sent you? The question was a trap they'd taught us to sidestep. The order's voice, brittle and precise, rose in my head. Never tell. Never give the order a name that could be pulled and hung. I considered the blade I'd hidden under an apron that morning. I considered every chokehold, every lesson in silence. I considered the soft press of Tardus's fingers against the paper as he opened it, revealing the crooked crowned wolf and the childish scrawl. His brow knit, not with hate, but with something else. Recognition? Sorrow? And he folded the scrap with the gentleness of someone handling a memory. Why would a child keep this? He murmured. Heat crawled beneath my skin. The sigil at my wrist burned like a brand whenever I thought of the order's oath. I pulled my sleeve instinctively, an old reflex to hide what bound me. Pain flared, sharp and immediate, like a cord tightening around my bones. I hissed, because hiding now had a cost. Tardus's hand paused. For a breath he looked, not at the paper, not at my face, but at the thin ribbon of skin peeking from beneath my cuff. The beta stiffened behind him. I started. Before the lie could settle into method, his fingers closed around my wrist. The sigil flared.
The sigil flared like struck flint, and pain unspooled beneath my skin. Sharp, chemical, a cold that tasted of iron and old promises. For a fraction of a heartbeat, the world narrowed to the heat of that burn and the heavy weight of the Alpha's fingers holding my wrist. He did not pull away. He simply watched as if he were reading a language written on my skin. Earlier that dusk I had passed the east wing and seen the beta bent over the battlements, speaking low to a sentry. He didn't look like a man indulging in idle chat. He catalogued, a ledger of small movements folded behind his steady jaw. Later, while I carried water past the guardhouse, I felt the pressure of his gaze and caught him noting the way my steps fell after curfew, the slack of my sleeve. He did not call me out. He didn't need to. A single dry word, shadow, left him for the sentry's ear and traveled faster than rumor. That whisper finds the Alpha long before I do. The beta's suspicion had a texture to it. I could feel it in the way servants angled away when he walked by, in how a pair of eyes in the corridor always lingered a beat longer. Suspicion spreads like oil, slick, invisible until it catches light. I should have felt the net and retreated. Instead, the rune on my wrist flared and burned and refused to be hidden. Tardus' touch was steadier than any teacher's. He held my wrist as if it were fragile porcelain, and the world's patience was brief. The beta's presence behind him was a taut cord. I could hear the alert in the way he held his breath. The scrap of the child's drawing in my other hand crinkled like a small animal trapped beneath my palm. I had not meant to carry the past into the threshold of the Alpha's study, but the hearth had given it up to me, and curiosity is a slow poison. You're hurt. His voice was low and careful, not a blade but a hand offering the unthinkable, concern. The Order's rules screamed at the edges of my mind, never reveal. Never advertise the truth that would save you from suspicion and condemn you to the gallows. The rune tasted like betrayal. Heat pooled in my face. My fingers moved to hide the mark in the scrap, but Tardus's thumb brushed my knuckles and the motion of concealment betrayed me. He watched the line of the sigil as if memorizing it. "An oath," he murmured. The word "a stone" he set down between us. "Not one our packs use." The beta's jaw worked. "Alpha," he started, voice thin with a soldier's displeasure at disorder. "Quiet," Tardus said. The single command stopped my companion like a net thrown over a bird. He stepped back as if honoring the space the Alpha had carved out. We moved through corridors that held the footprints of generations. With every step I felt exposure expand, eyes above the parapets, whispers that feathered the corners of doors, the hush that follows unpleasant discovery. Tardus guided me, slow and sure, to a guest chamber that smelled of lavender and old wool. His hand never left my wrist. As the door closed behind us, the fortress seemed to exhale and then, impossibly, hold its breath again. The beta's suspicion had reached its teeth into the household. If he fed his worry into the Alpha's curiosity, the river of rumor would become a flood. I had been taught 1,000 deaths, but never how to live if my past decided my fate. Tardus looked down at me, eyes not cruel but expectant, and said quietly, with a weight that made the word feel like a verdict, "Tell me the truth, Lyra Nightshade. Why did you come here?"
He led me to the guest chamber as if escorting a wounded hound rather than a woman bound to secret vows. The corridor hummed with ordinary life. Boots, gossip, the clink of a spoon. But under it all, I felt the steady drum of his attention. Tardus walked with that peculiar economy of motion I'd only ever seen in trained hunters. Nothing wasted, everything watched. His hand never left the imprint of my wrist. The medica arrived with linen and oil, an older woman whose eyes had the kind of softness that came from stitching other people's wounds back into usefulness. She hummed as she worked, unwrapping the sleeve until the rune showed itself again, like a thing that refused to be polite. "It's an old knot," she said, more to herself than to either of us. Her fingers traced the lines, gentle and unafraid. Not common in these parts, treaty marks, punishments, or oaths taken in the dark. She frowned, then shrugged. The medica's job was to tend, not to judge. Tardus watched every movement like a man memorizing the shape of a storm. He asked almost nothing at first, small practical questions that made their way to a marrow of meaning. Does it burn often? Does it ache with the moon? When I answered in the measured half-truths the order had taught me, he let the silence stretch. It pressed against me in a way a blade never had. There was a peculiar intimacy to his gaze, sharp, appraising, not the hot glare of a tyrant, but the quiet focus of someone cataloging what matters. I had rehearsed 1,000 ways to be invisible. I never rehearsed what it was like to be seen by the man I had been trained to kill. The label Alpha I'd repeated in my head for years shattered like thin glass when he smiled. Small, not amused, but the soft curve of a man surprised into gentleness. "You moved through the kitchens the way a thief moves through shadow," he said at last. "You know when to slip, when to wait? Why hide such skill among kettles and lint?" I could have said, "Instrument of the order, blade waiting." I could have lied and claimed a hard life in a northern hamlet. The truth was heavier than either. I was a child shaped into obedience, a body taught to obey a command without asking why. Instead, I wrapped the lie around my voice and let it fall. "I am good at my work." He relaxed a little. The beta lingered in the doorway, his silhouette a constant tally of suspicion. He did not speak, but his presence pressed at the edges of the room like someone testing a seam. Tardus set the scrap of drawing gently on a table, then looked at me in a way that made my bones feel uncovered. "You will stay in the guest wing for now," he said. His voice was a decree wrapped in something unreadable. "The medica will check you twice a day. No one leaves without my leave." It was sanctuary and chain all at once, protection that smelled faintly of ownership. My training shouted that closeness was a risk. My learned loyalty whispered that any link might be used against me. I had been taught to taste the metal of a throat and call it victory. Now the thought of strangling the man who had given me shelter curdled into something obscene. As a guard opened the door to lead me to a quieter room, Tardus stopped. Close enough that I could feel the heat of him, he inclined his head and said, in a voice that lowered to something almost private, "Tell me the truth later, Lyra. If you hide things from me, I will know." His gaze held mine like a promise and a threat braided together. The door swung shut behind us, but his look did not leave. Outside, in the corridor, a shadow moved, someone watching, noting, and when the whisper carried back to my ears, it was a single word that tasted like a blade. Order.
They moved me as you move a wounded fox. Soft hands, measured steps, all the while watching for the moment I might turn. The guest wing was small and scented of lavender and old wool, a kindness arranged like a trap. The medica bandaged the wound with cool cloths and hummed the old songs of binding while her fingers worked. Each syllable stitched me a little tighter into the fortress like thread through cloth. I told myself I could endure it. Endurance was the scaffolding of my life. Hold the line, do the task, keep the secret. But in the quiet between the medica's humming and the clink of the basin, the order's voice rose behind my ribs, sharp, patient, a thing that had lived inside me longer than my own name. Swear, kill, obey. The memory of the elder's blade pressing hot to my palm made my fingers twitch against the linen, as if I could feel the metal still. Tardus came often. He brought no questions at first, only small mercies. Hot broth, a book whose pages smelled of dust and honey, the rare, careful silence that meant he would not pry. He would sit by the window, his silhouette a steady thing in the dusk, and read whatever ledger he had taken from the archives today. Sometimes his eyes would lift and find me, and there was a look then, so precise it felt like weighing a blade, that made my chest throb with both shame and something more dangerous. A strange, foolish hope. The beta did not leave. He patrolled the wing like a storm cloud on a slow orbit, his glances a metronome of suspicion. Once, as I bent to fold a blanket, I caught the way his hand brushed a belt and the stiff shape of an impressed token. He had begun to collect small certainties, the sort a man keeps for dark nights when stories do not stick. He spoke to the medica in hushed tones. Someone passed a note to the sentry. Rumors moved faster than truth here. I kept my mind busy. I mended a coat, learned the thread counts on the pillows, memorized the footfall of the medica so I could tell when she left the corridor and when I could breathe. But the order's lessons are not only of steel, they are patterns you wear like skin. I had been taught to read rooms where traitors hid. The guest wing itself felt like a book I could not close. That evening my quiet unspooled. I had folded the child's scrap and tucked it beneath a loose plank beneath the window. There it felt smaller somehow, less like a promise and more like a question. I was smoothing the cloth when a shadow fell through the glass. Tardus returning much earlier than his usual hour. He did not come to his chair. He came to the footlocker at the end of the bed and drew a thin volume, a ledger wrapped in leather, its edges frayed, its clasp set with a dull stone. He opened it with the gentleness of a man unwrapping a relic. I could see the angles of his face in the lamplight change. His jaw tightened as if he had tasted something wrong. He read for a time without moving. Then, softer than a judgment, he said a name I had not heard aloud in months. Order of Shadows. The word was a thing like a stone dropped in water. Circles spread outward, small, and every memory the order had taught me shivered under the surface. My palms went cold. I had imagined 1,000 ways he would find out, by blade, by confession, by the black-humored corner of a guard's gossip, but never by the slow, terrible patience of paper. Behind him, the beta's silhouette filled the doorway. His voice was a dry wire. They bind with oaths. If she is their instrument. Tardus closed the book with a sound that felt like a seal. He did not look at me when he said what came next. He spoke as one reads a calculation already made. Then we must know how tight the strings are. The sentence hung between us like a blade poised above a throat. I tasted metal on my tongue.
Tardus set the ledger between us like a map to a country I had never meant to visit. The room smelled of oil and the faint tang of heated metal. The lamplight turned leather to honey. He opened the pages with care, as if the ink might shatter under a wrong touch. The beta stayed by the door, shoulders coiled. The medica had retreated to pretend the work of bandages was all that held the knight's balance. Read. His voice was more an order to myself than to me. My fingers hovered over the spidery script like a thief over a lock. The book was fuller of names than I expected. Places struck from maps, alliances inked in the margins, a ledger of deaths thinly disguised as accidents, barn fires, hunting mishaps, roads that gave way. Here and there were symbols stamped in a swift, certain hand, a pale sigil that matched the ghost under my sleeve. "The Order keeps records," Tardus said. "They keep just enough to remind themselves they are right." He tapped a line, the penitent arc of handwriting, for balance, for the pacts that would be broken. His finger stayed on the paper like a vow. Heat climbed my throat. I remembered the elder's voice, how she taught us mercy folded into murder, how she traced the same glyph across my palm and said, "You are a blade that keeps the world even." I had never asked what balance meant beyond our blade. "You knew?" I asked, though the answer coiled in my gut. "No." Tardus's answer surprised me in its steadiness. "But this is not justice. It is a ledger of control." His jaw tightened. "They mark and bind those they deem obstinate. They make pawns of children." He looked at me then, and the question in his eyes was not accusation, but hunger for truth. "Did they tell you what the sigil would do beyond bind you?" My mouth closed around a dozen rehearsed lies. The medica had stitched. The beta had watched. The fortress had shifted its weight so that I might breathe easier. But the Order had never taught me why the bindings existed beyond their tidy moral grammar. I swallowed and breathed out whatever truth I could spare. "They said it would keep me true," I whispered, "that it would ensure the balance. They called it a protection." "Protection that murders," the beta cut in, voice low. He crossed the room and pointed to a slim folio tucked between the ledger's pages. "This is a ritual notation. See here. Inked with lunar marks, they activate the oath at the moon. Blood answered by blood." The words fell through me like cold rain. Moon. The medica's candle hissed. In my head, the Order's litany distorted, new syllables building into a sentence I had not imagined. The sigil as a trigger, not merely a leash. I felt my training coil back into me, the reflex to pull a blade, to flee, to hide. But Tardus caught my wrist before I could move, his grip an anchor. "They use rites to make obedience permanent," he said quietly. "They orchestrate deaths, so the pacts fear the price of dissent." He closed the ledger and looked at me with a softness that felt like the first honest thing I had seen in years. "You weren't a killer because you are cruel, Lyra. You were a weapon given a purpose and told it was holy." I wanted to curl into the bed and sleep until the world rewired itself. Instead, I tasted shame, thick, metallic, and something stranger. A seed of rage at having been carved to serve someone else's god. Outside, a wind moved across the ramparts, and the moon slid a thin coin of light through the narrow window. The beta's hand found the map on the table and stabbed at a note with the impatient certainty of a man who expects storms. "The mating ceremony is set for the blood moon," he said, and the room reoriented around the handful of words. The medica drew a quiet breath like someone hearing a death knell in a distant church. For a breath, the world held, and then the truth crashed forward. Ritual and mating on the same night. The Order's ink and the Pact's vows colliding under the moon the way two knives might meet. Tardus's fingers tightened on my wrist until I felt the pressure of his promise. "We have 3 nights," he said, voice low as a vow. We will uncover every thread before the moon finds us. I wanted to believe him with the ferocity I used to reserve for killing. But somewhere in the back of my bones an oath hummed, patient and cold, waiting, perhaps, to collect its price. The thought of the moon answering that call made my whole body small with fear. Someone knocked at the door then, sharp, urgent, and a voice outside said a single name that felt like an accusation and a warning. Both. Lyra Nightshade.
The fortress had never felt so alive. Everywhere I turned, the stone corridors whispered with urgency, servants rushing with silk banners dyed in crimson and silver, warriors polishing armor until it gleamed like captured starlight, the scent of roasted venison thick in the air. They called it celebration. To me, it felt like preparation for a sacrifice. My sacrifice. The blood moon was 2 nights away, and its light already tinged the horizon whenever dusk fell. Wolves whispered of fate, of bonds unbreakable. The Omega girls giggled as they tried on dresses, hoping the goddess's gaze might favor them, even though everyone knew the Alpha had already chosen. He had chosen me. I scrubbed at a stone stair until my fingers ached, though the task was done long ago. Anything to keep my hands busy, anything to quiet the pounding in my chest. This was wrong. I was not meant to be adorned as Luna. I was meant to kill him. The Order had trained me for years, had bound me in blood to that purpose, and yet, every time his eyes found mine across a crowded hall, I felt my resolve wither like paper in flame. Tardus did not look at me like prey. He looked at me as if he saw through every mask I wore, and still he lingered. Last night I caught him in the courtyard, alone, staring up at the rising moon. He didn't speak when he sensed me. He only looked at me, as if searching for something in my silence. My throat had burned with words I could not say. Now, as the banners unfurled above the fortress gates, the Beta's eyes tracked me again. Always watching, always calculating. He saw the way I slipped out after dark, the way I lingered near forbidden halls. I could feel suspicion coiling tighter around me with every passing hour, and yet no blade struck, no punishment came. Instead, whispers spread. The Alpha had found his Luna. The thought stole the air from my lungs. The Order had told me Tardus was merciless, a tyrant whose death would free the world. But what tyrant let a servant move unseen in his halls? What tyrant looked at a girl from the kitchens with reverence, not disdain? That night, I returned to my narrow cot, staring up at the rough-hewn ceiling. My body trembled with the weight of 2 chains, the vow that demanded his blood, and the bond pulling me into his orbit. The blood moon was coming. Its red light would seal fates, expose lies, and mark the chosen. And I knew, with a terror deeper than any blade could cut, that when it rose, I would not belong to the Order anymore. I would belong to him.
The clearing smelled of wet earth and smoke, and something older than fear. Torches stitched the night with gold. Faces leaned forward like they expected a story and wanted the cruel part first. The circle hummed with a cadence that lived in my ribs. The drums, the low chanting, the soft tram of feet. Above us, the blood moon hung like a wound the sky could not hide, slow and fat and patient. They led me barefoot across crushed rushes. My ankles prickled with cold and iron. The rune under my sleeve pulsed in time to the drums, a private heartbeat I could not silence. The elders sat like weathered stones, mouths folded against time. I could feel the pack breathing as one organism, curiosity and hunger, and the old hunger for pairing that would keep lines from fraying. Tardus walked beside me, his presence a steady pressure thing that steadied and terrified me all at once. He did not glance at the crowd. He did not preen for their cheers. He kept his eyes on mine as if the rest of the ring did not exist. An intimacy that stripped me bare worse than any accusation. When the Alpha called, his voice did not need proclamation. It thrummed through the clearing. We call to the moon. We call to the halves the goddess made whole. Time collapsed to a thin thread. The drumming slowed. Breaths counted like beads. Tardus stopped before the center and offered his hand, not with command, but with a gravity that made the air tilt. "Lyra Nightshade," he said. The name fell like a coin into water. When he spoke it, it sounded like it had always been meant for me and never had. My feet moved of their own accord. The order's lessons ran ragged at the edge of my mind. Never let them see you falter. Never let them see the blade that trembles beneath the apron. I had rehearsed the kill in 100 ways, pale and clinical in the dark of the training hall. I had imagined the moment a dozen times, seen his surprise, the blood on his robes, the liberation like a clean cut. Now, with the moon watching like an audience of gods, the thought of his blood made bile rise. Not because I loved him. How could I love the monster I had been taught to hate? But because something in his presence had unraveled my catechism. He had been kind in corners where cruelty was expected. His hands bore honest calluses, not the stains of tyranny. Tardus reached for my hand. His palm was warm when it closed around mine. He pressed his forehead to mine in a motion that felt like prayer and claim at once. The drumming held. Then he bit. The world narrowed to the metallic scorch of his teeth and the sudden hot flood of his blood in my mouth. Pain flared, bright and intimate, and then melted into warmth that threaded through my veins like sun through glass. The pack breathed around us as one, some in size, some low, some with the sharp gasps of surprise. The bite sealed in a pull that I could not deny. It anchored me with a gravity older than language. And beneath that new, fierce warmth, something cold awakened. The rune at my wrist screamed like ice being struck. It answered the moon in a way I had never felt before, not a whisper but a green ice chorus inside my bones. Fulfill, fulfill, fulfill. The sound came not from the crowd, but from the raw places inside me, a command I had learned to obey without question. Tardus's teeth still grazed my skin. His hand tightened, steady and sure. I could feel 2 threads pulling, one fierce and binding toward him, the other a taut, ancient cord demanding payment. Someone at the edge of the circle hissed a single name like a warning. It was a word I had been taught to fear and obey. The beta's fingers whitened on his knife. Tardus looked up, eyes dark with a question I did not want to answer and could not refuse. The moon's bloodlight made the air thin and electric. My taste of copper filled my mouth. The drumbeat stuttered like a faltering heart. I had been claimed, and the vow inside me had answered.
The crowd thinned like fog being torn away, leaving a ring of faces still bright with torchlight, still hungry for meaning. Hands reached for the air where we had stood, as if touching that small space might grant them proof the goddess had chosen rightly. Tardus led me back toward the fortress with the quiet authority of a tide, his palm at the hollow of my back, guiding me through the press as if I were fragile china he'd swear to keep intact. The bite had sealed in more than blood. The ache in my mouth had settled into a slow burn, and if I closed my eyes I could feel the ghost echo of his pulse in a place that had never known anything but the order's rhythm. His scent, smoke and iron and something like steadiness, had woven itself into the seams of my skin. I woke tasting it when the world around me dimmed. The bond hummed, a string tuned to his frequency. When he drew near, my bones answered. We paused on the steps of the fortress. Tardus unhooked a cloak from a passing guard and wrapped it around my shoulders with the awkward tenderness of someone learning how to be gentle. "You did not falter," he said softly. His voice steadied me more than the cloak. "You stood." I wanted to tell him the truth, that in the moment when his teeth found my throat, a whole litany of other voices clamored in my head, and some of them were mine, taught to me by hands that called themselves saviors. But words are knives, and I had spent my life learning how to hold them at the right angle. So I kept my secret folded under my ribs and nodded. The medica met us at the great doors, her lantern painting worry into the small lines at her eyes. She unwrapped the bite with practiced calm, fingers uncannily sure. "A deep mark," she murmured, and I watched the way her mouth curved at the edges. Not pity, but professional curiosity. "She's claimed. The bond is true." Around us a murmur rose like wind through reeds. Approval, awe, a smell of something like relief. Not everyone breathed relief. Elders exchanged glances that read like ledger entries. An old woman in the front row folded her hands so tight her knuckles paled. A child whispered something, and a man nearby laughed too hard, a brittle sound that broke under the weight of the night. The beta's eyes were a constant, darting from face to face, tallying reactions, measuring the treacherous distances between thought and action. He lingered near the doors as if ensuring we passed beneath the threshold without incident. As we moved deeper into the fortress, the rune under my sleeve flared, an answering spark to the moon's claim. Pain lanced through me like winter lightning. For a moment, the world fractured. I saw, not with my eyes, but with the marrow of memory, the elder's hands across my palm, the oath being spoken, the cold ritual words that had tied me to a purpose that was not mine. The flash was quick, and I swallowed it down like an unwelcome tide. Someone beside me gasped, heads turned, whispers braided together, thin and dangerous. Order, pawn, traitor. Each syllable landed like a pebble in still water, widening ripples beyond control. The medica glanced up, her face an island of professional calm that could not quite hide the tremor at the edges. Tardus tightened his fingers on my wrist. I felt the pressure through cloth, a message in a simple grip. Do not let this be the first of many. His jaw set, a line carved from resolve. A man near the stair, an elder with a mouth like folded parchment, lifted his chin. He did not speak loud, but the hiss of his single word moved the crowd faster than any trumpet. Traitor. The beta's head snapped. Tardus's body did too, every muscle ready. Around us, the echo of that one naming spread like a stain. I tasted iron again, but now it was fear and expectation, and the metallic tang of a secret finally smelling the light. If the pack questioned, if seeds of doubt found soil, the Order's plans would not need to move a step. They had already planted thorns.
The morning after, the fortress felt like a thing that could split. Where laughter had been an easy habit, now silence sat like a stone in every throat. I moved through halls that watched me. Every servant's step sounded like a verdict. Children who had clung to my skirts the week before kept a careful distance, as if proximity might burn them. The rune under my sleeve throbbed with a slow, patient hunger, an animal waking and remembering its chain. Tardus walked beside me as if the air itself might try to steal me away. He did not pretend the whispers were not real. He answered some short, efficient reassurances that smoothed doubt for a breath, but there were no grand defenses. His eyes, when they landed on me, were a steady harbor. "Walk with me," he said once, his voice a hand on the small of my back. It steadied my legs like strong ropes. But whispers have weight. They gather, tumble into one another, and become an avalanche almost before you know they moved. The beta took that weight and made it a thing to carry. His posture was a hunting stance now, less watching than hunting. He moved through the crowd with an ease that made old alliances look brittle, and when he spoke to elders, his words were taut as wire. By midday, an elder called a council, the great hall filled with faces like weathered maps, lines that told of many winters, eyes sharp as barbs. I sat with my hands folded in my lap and felt the heat of a dozen stares prick through the thin cloth. Men coughed, children shuffled. The medica sat near the doorway with her palms folded, a professional mask on that could not quite still the tremor at the corners of her eyes. An elder rose, small, with a mouth that folded into judgment like a coin into a slot. "We stand at the cusp of change," he intoned. "The moon chose, yet the moon's choice must not be a cloak for treachery." It was a phrase meant to be a wedge. Murmurs spidered out across the benches. The beta stepped forward then, all polite edges. He set down on the elder's table a small bundle, wrapped in linen, the sort of thing a servant might tuck away and forget. "We found this in the guest wing," he said. His voice slid across the room. "A scrap of paper and a token. Evidence should speak before rumor does." My heart stopped like a caught animal. My fingers wanted to move, to snatch, to crush whatever he produced. Tardus's hand tightened at my back. The pressure said as plainly as any word, "Do not make this worse." The beta unwrapped the linen with a slow courtesy. He revealed a child's drawing first, a crude wolf with a crooked crown, the name Tardus scrawled beneath it. It was small, foolish, somehow intimate. A hush fell. Some looked puzzled, others sour. Then he unfolded the second thing, a thin slip of pale vellum, inked in a cipher I knew better than air. A sigil, not drawn like a prize but stamped, precise as a blade's edge. It matched the lines I had felt under my skin since childhood, the knot the elders had bound to my palm and called oath. My mouth went dry. The rune in my wrist flared as if answering recognition. Whispers stopped being whispers and became a current you could ride into certainty. The Medica's hands hovered over her lap. Tardus's jaw worked. I felt the tremor of his restraint at my shoulder. No one spoke at first. And then the elder's voice, thin, high with the promise of callers, asked, "Who among us will speak for the order's reach? Who will deny the shape of this thing?" I wanted to scream that I had been a child in their hands, that the line had been drawn on me before I knew what a name meant. I wanted to tell Tardus every horror and every lesson and all the ways the order had made me a blade. Instead, I watched the pale symbol on the vellum catch torchlight and thought, with the quiet terror of a thing that has been found, they have proof now.
The council had barely dissolved into scattered conversations when the rider came like a winter shadow, boots thudding, cloak slashed with travel, a messenger who smelled of rain and old ash. Nobody barred his path. He strode to the center of the hall and laid a sealed scroll on the oaken table as if it were a thing beyond argument. The seal was pale and familiar in the gut, an icy sigil I had felt press into my skin as a child. Tardus did not break the wax at once. He stared at it the way one stares at a wound and hopes it will close itself. Around him the elders shifted. Some paled, others thickened like bark. The beta's hand found the hilt of his knife the way a man finds ballast. The hall was a held breath. When the Alpha broke the seal and unrolled the parchment, the lines seemed to move across the page like slow worms. The handwriting was cruelly neat. I read it as his eyes moved, each word a step into a pit I already knew the shape of. Lyra Nightshade, Pawn, and Oathbearer. You were bound in blood to restore balance. You were given chance and purpose. Complete the vow. Strike your Alpha in the shadow of the blood moon, or be erased. Refuse, shelterers, those who keep you, will be judged as accomplices and burned with you. The lines were not argument, they were an edict painted in cold light. The parchment smelled faintly of ink and bone. At the last line, a small smear of true blood had been pressed into the margin, a tiny, unmistakable token that made the stomach tilt. They could always know. The elders' faces changed in the slow way of weather. "This is," one began, voice thin as frost. "Terror," the beta finished, steady as iron. "They give a choice that is a trap. If she kills, our law breaks. If she does not, we watch her die by hands we cannot easily catch." Tardus rolled the parchment, his jaw a stone. He set his fist upon the table as if to press his will into the wood. "They will not take her," he said, low and absolute. "Not while I draw breath." An old woman near the benches, her knuckles like bleached shells, rose with the weight of generations. "Alpha, to defy an order is to invite ruin. They do not threaten for sport. They bind the conscience and punish those who refuse." Her eyes found me as if counting the cost in years. "What will be sacrificed for this protection?" The room paled and shrank. I felt each face like an accusation. The rune under my sleeve pulsed, answering the script as if in sympathy. The memory of the Elder's blade, the oath at my palm, the cold incantation folded in my bones, each returned like a returning tide. Pain uncoiled, sudden and keen, as if the paper's words had reached inside and pricked the cord that had been sleeping. "You could hand me to them," I heard the thought, my thought, as if it were an idea that had always been mine. The voice that had taught me to obey lifted in the corners of my mind, "Fulfill what you swore. Balance will be kept." The echo made my fingers clench. Tardus saw the flare under my sleeve. His hand moved to my wrist, steady as a compass. "We will not bargain with murderers," he said to the hall, but his gaze slid for a fraction to the doorway, to the night beyond the stones. "We prepare, we seek counsel and, if need be, allies, but we will not surrender a soul." The elder who had spoken folded her hands and let out a breath that sounded like a prayer or a warning. I couldn't tell which. "Then the choice will be made by blood and moon," she said. Outside, the wind carried a sound like distant steps, too many and too measured for ordinary scouts. A courier? No, something deliberate. In the doorway, a shadow detached and tossed a small black ribbon to the floor. It uncoiled and smoldered when caught by a stray ember from the brazier. The smoke curled upward and, portentous as omen, took the shape of the order's sigil for a breath before dispersing. The rune on my wrist screamed so loud I thought my teeth would crack. Pain flared into white light. I bent, as if struck. The hall around me blurred into the edges of a world too small for the storm that had just been set. Tardus's hand was at my shoulder like iron. "They have given us a clock," he said. His voice was not thunder so much as an axe finding its mark. "We will meet it on our terms." But the oath inside me answered not to terms and not to men. It answered to a code older than mercy. And in the curling smoke above the brazier, I saw my future split into two knives, both hungry. Someone at the back of the hall hissed a single terrible word: "Prepare."
The days after the ultimatum tasted of iron and hurry. The fortress moved with a new rhythm, sharper, rehearsed, like a creature learning a scar. Men sharpened blades until the edge of metal sang. Women sewed extra pouches into cloaks. The medica brewed bitter draughts and muttered old prayers into their smoke. Everywhere I turned, people prepared to fight a war that smelled faintly of someone else's righteousness. They prepared for battle, but the thing that cinched at my throat was not steel, but memory. The rune under my sleeve had never been merely a mark. It was a contract carved into bone. In idle moments, it pulsed like a living thing, and sometimes it called up the ritual in pieces. An elder's humming voice, the pressure of the ritual blade, the warm iron of the sigil pressed to palm. Those fragments had always been stories I swallowed without chewing. Now they sat in my mouth like grit. Tardus never left my side for long. He walked the ramparts with the beta, talk low and urgent, then returned to the guest wing with plans and maps spread across the table like hunting patterns. He would look at me, the way a man looks at something fragile and refuses to look away, and say, "We will not let them choose her fate." His hand would close around mine, and for a moment the rune eased, as if his touch was a salve. Then the oath remembered and tightened its grip. The medica, who had mended more wounds than any of us could count, worked on ways to blunt the sigil's claws. She soaked linens in herbs that smelled of thyme and iron. She painted runes of small protection she said were old wives' tricks, though her voice carried a scholar's doubt. Once, when she thought I slept, she pressed a worn parchment into my palm, an old folk rhyme about counterbinds. "It may slow the hunger," she whispered, "but oaths like that, they are not undone by charm. They answer to law and old blood." The beta patrolled like a man with a ledger of danger filling on his shoulders. He set watches tighter, questioned riders, sent scouts farther than usual. When he looked at me now, it was not only suspicion, but the pragmatism of a man who must decide whether a blade is worth the risk of keeping around the hearth. He did not soften often, but once, in the dim of the armory, he said quietly, "If they try to force you, Lyra, do not let them make a martyr of the pack." His words were not counsel, but a calculation. His eyes asked whether I would choose the lesser ruin. Choose. The verb tasted like metal. I had trained my whole life to obey, not to choose. The elder's voice in my memory hissed the old litany. Balance first. The herd before the king. I had believed it until the day a man, Tardus, offered me kindness that did not demand a ledger. The kindness had not dissolved the oath. It had made the idea of killing him unbearable. Night after night, I found myself awake, hands clenched at the rough wool of my blanket, imagining the moment the order would expect me to strike. Would I raise a knife? Could I pull the blade across a throat that had traced warmth into my skin? The thought of his blood curdled something inside me I did not know existed. Not love in the bright, foolish way of songs, but a tether that made betrayal impossible without breaking myself. The rune answered to the moon, and the moon was a slow drumbeat now. Each night it swelled a little larger in the sky, its shadow casting thinner the line between obligation and desire. The fortress hummed around me with readiness, but what I feared was how the oath lived inside me, patient and waiting. It did not need the order to whisper. It could wake on its own. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, the medica came with news that turned the air cold. An old woman, an exile with whispered knowledge of binding rights, had been seen on a road not far from the borders. She was said to know the old counterwords, the murky language the order had once used against itself. Hope is a small, sharp thing. When I reached for it, my fingers brushed the rune and it flared so hot that I cried out. Tardus was across the room in an instant, his face gone iron. "Tell me," he said, every syllable an order wrapped in fear. I opened my mouth and the elder's voice in my head answered first. "Fulfill." The room tilted and the sound outside the wall rose like wind. I had a choice to tell him the truth, to beg for a way out, to reach for the exile and the chance she might offer. I had a choice to betray everything I had been taught. My lips parted. The oath inside me tightened like a coiling rope. Before I could speak, a horn sounded, single, low, deliberate, from the outer gate. Not the alarm I expected, not the rapid war call, but the slow note of arrival. A shadow detached on the road beyond the barbican, moving toward the fortress with the slow certainty of someone who carries news that will change everything.
We climbed to the parapet because the room felt like a throat closing. Stone underfoot, the night above like a black pool, and the fortress a small island of light. Tardus walked beside me, shoulders a steady weight. The beta lingered where the stair turned, silent as a dark hinge. The wind tasted of coming rain and something metallic, fear wearing the scent of iron. "Tell me everything," he said once we found a place where the moon could not quite catch us. His voice was close and careful. It wasn't an order. It felt like a demand from the only person I did not want to disappoint and did not dare to hurt. So I told him. I told him about the order of shadows the way one tells of a plague. Clinical, ashamed, and too full of the small seamed details that prove reality. How the elders bent us over the ritual stone and pressed the sigil into our palms with a blade warmed to red. How they taught us songs that tasted like guilt. Balance. Herd before king. How they fed us stories of alphas who ate their packs until the image of Tardus's name was an easy target. How they tied the rune to moon and blood, so the oath would answer even when they slept. I told him that I had been given a blade and a purpose, that I had learned to move like a shadow inside his halls, and that my lesson had always ended with a throat to be sliced at the blood moon. I said the words, and felt them hang between us like the smoke of a candle I'd nearly burned down. When I finished, the wind filled the silence, an honest, unwelcome thing. Tardus did not fling me away. He did not cry betrayal into the night. He listened until the truth had the finality of a closed door. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked then, not sharp, but raw, as if a wound might be more bearable than the question that had no edges. Because the order had trained me not to tell, because the oath would find me if I did, because I had sworn with a blade to obey a cause I did not understand, because I was afraid, because I loved him in ways I would not have believed possible. The words tumbled out, each confession a stone I set at his feet. He closed his eyes against the moon and opened them on me like a man who had been learning to read his own map, only to find lines he never drew. "You were a child when they bound you," he said at last. "They made you a weapon for themselves and named you righteous for it." Shame flushed my face. I thought of the elder's gnarled hands, the way she had smiled when my palm bled the first time. "I was given a mission," I murmured. "I came here to kill you. I practiced the thoughts. I rehearsed the cut. And then—" My throat closed. "Then you bit me." His thumb found the seam of my sleeve and brushed toward the rune. I felt it flare like a living thing answering a call. "I know," he said simply. "I see it." "What will you do?" I asked, voice brittle. I expected the silence that means exile, the cold commands that turn people into currency. I expected the fortress to fold me away and hand me over like a gift to scare others straight. He took a long breath. The wind picked up, carrying a loose ribbon from the banners and whipping it into a frantic dance. "I will not hand you to those who taught you to be a murderer," he said finally, but the words were not a promise so much as a challenge he had not yet resolved. "We will fight them. We will find the counterwords your Medica spoke of. We will call allies." Relief, small and dangerous, eased something in my chest. I opened my mouth to tell him everything I knew of the Order's rhythms, of hidden ledgers and the way they choreographed accidents. I reached for the map of their lies. A shout cut through the night, sharp, urgent. The Beta's silhouette moved like a thrown spear toward the courtyard. Someone below cried a single word I knew too well and hated: "Riders." Light flared on the eastern road, a scatter of lanterns, then more, coming fast, not the slow approach of traders, but the disciplined pace of purpose. For a moment everything stood on the edge of a blade. Tardus's hand tightened around mine so hard I tasted the iron of worry. "They're here," he said. The moon hung above us, blood-bright and indifferent. The oath in my flesh screamed in answer.
He stood in the great hall like a tide stopping for a stone, impossible to move, inevitable. When Tardus spoke, the room leaned with him. He did not shout, the way men try to cover an ache with loudness. He simply said my name, and then said what I felt in my bones, that I would not be given away. "You will not hand her to killers," he told the elders, and his voice was a cliff-edge calm. "Lyra is under my protection. Any who move to force her from these walls will find the pack full of men and women who call me Alpha in their way." The air changed. Some faces brightened, others darkened like approaching weather. The elder with the parchment folded his hands tight enough that I feared for the knuckles. The Beta, ever the watchful ledger, gave a curt nod that was almost a permission, as if he had weighed the risk and found the scale balanced enough to trust. Even he, who had stared suspicion at me like an old wound, did not openly disagree. My chest felt like a slow drum. Words wanted to come, confessions and apologies, and the 1,000 explanations that never justify what was done to a child. Instead, I let Tardus speak for me, the man I had been sent to kill, now defending me with a fierceness that unstitched the catechism stitched into my bones. He did not excuse the order. He named them. He did not ask them for mercy. He promised them consequences. "You were born under hands that thought themselves righteous," he said, his eyes finding mine. "But I have watched you upright when fear would have made you bend. I have seen you choose what was right in small things. That choice is yours, not theirs." His words fell on me like rain. The thing that loosened first was not my oath, cold and patient and hungry, but guilt, heavy as damp wool. The thought that I had put this pack in danger, that men and women might die because I had been shaped as a weapon, cut me sharper than any blade. I saw shoulders tighten as plans were exchanged, heard the clang of armor being readied as if preparation could be a salve. Tardus closed the gap between us. He brushed my hair from my forehead, fingers rough with work and tenderness. His mouth moved near my ear. "Stand with me," he whispered. "No command, only an anchor. We will fight them together. We will not let the Order write our story." I wanted to say the oath would call, that my blood would answer what it had sworn. I wanted to confess that maybe even this decision was another lesson learned too late. But looking at him, at the weight he took on for me, the way his hand fit around mine as if fate could be clenched and steered, I found a small, dangerous courage. "I will not let them make you a martyr," the beta said then, stepping forward with a soldier's simple arithmetic. "If they move on her, they move on us. We prepare the walls, we set watches, we send riders to the border clans. We do not hide, and we do not bargain." Plans knitted themselves in the room, maps spread, riders named, scouts dispatched. The Medica brought herbs and things the ancient rites might hate and called them countermeasures. The elders argued and then, slowly, agreed to a readiness that tasted like reluctant hope. When at last the meeting broke, the fortress became a hive of purposeful motion. Men strapped leather, women readied pouches, children were tucked behind stout doors. Every small act felt like a vow, a refusal to yield to fear. Tardus walked me to the parapet again, the cold wind stealing at our cloaks. He did not hide the strain from his face. He only wore his resolve openly. Beneath us, torches flickered along the road, and on the far ridge shadows moved with a deliberate slowness. A horn sounded then, long and low, and beyond the dark line of trees, I saw the faint flare of many small fires lighting in sequence like a string of clotted stars. Someone below voiced the name in a hush that had no room for hope. The Order.
Dawn did not come gentle. It ripped across the horizon like a blade, spilling red through the trees and throwing the world into a glass of fire. The horn that split the pre-dawn air was not our simple alarm. It was a summons to war. Men and women answered it with the practiced calm of those who had kissed the edge of steel and returned. Tardus moved like the tide that shapes cliffs, steady, inevitable. He stood at the gate, cloak whipping, voice low and full of command as he laid orders on men who already knew what to do. The beta was everywhere at once. Eyes on the ramparts, hands on bows, a voice humming out counters and placements like a man reciting the bones of a map. I read the urgency in the way the Medica clutched her satchel and in the tightened shoulders of the older elders who had once only argued over boundaries. They had not come as a single wave. The Order's first strike came in shards, a line of riders, banners black with pale sigils, silent figures slipping through the scrub to the rear, and, worst of all, a team of cloaked assailants who carried packets that hissed like trapped things when tossed into thatch. Fire took to the outer stables before a dozen breaths had passed. We met them with the raw truth of bodies and blades. Steel sang. Shields took votive knocks. The courtyard became a body that breathed in and out with blows and cries. I moved among it like a ghost I had learned to be, hands steady, blade finding any vulnerable place a man offered, throat pressed to the wind. I saved a drummer who stumbled, shoved a shield into a child's hand, and shoved the child back from where a dying man slumped. My muscles remembered technique before my heart remembered mercy. But the rune under my sleeve remembered its own language. With each beat of the enemy's banners, the sigil throbbed as if it had a throat of its own. Every time a banner with that pale, hateful mark rose, a knife of pain cleaved through my forearms. The Order had not come merely with swords. They had brought symbol and incantation woven into cloth and song. Their drums, thin, high, were a cadence meant to unmake oaths and make others answer. The Medica, hands shaking, huddled with the elders, and tried to speak the counterwords the exile might have taught. Her voice rattled against the clang of metal and the smoke and fell short more than once. A cloaked figure struck toward her like shadow-hunting light. I sprinted, and there was a blade where the medica had been poised. The figure moved in a blur, and for a breath I saw the shape of someone who had taught me rituals by candle. An older hand, a voice that once praised my willing palm. My stomach folded like a thing that has been betrayed. Tardus was everywhere. He fought the way someone fights for a thing that is all their beating, deliberate, quick, merciless only around those who would harm his people. At one point he swept low and took a man who carried a black ribbon, ripping the standard free and flinging it to the dirt. For a second, the order's rhythm stuttered. But the order had depth. From the eastern slope came a snarled cry, and then the thud of a ram against the inner gate. Men poured to hold it, shields braced, and the world narrowed down to the smell of wood, sweat, and smoke. My shoulders screamed, my fingers cramped on the hilt of my blade. And then I heard it, clear as a bell over the din, the name spoken in a voice that had once been a lullaby and later a whip. Lyra Nightshade. It had the cadence of command, and the syllables wrapped in the ritual language the order used to wake the oath in me. Pain exploded along my wrist, white and hot and insistent. The world telescope expanded into the single point of that hurt and of that voice. I staggered, vision blurring. Around me warriors threw themselves against the ram. Tardus turned, eyes slitting until black. From the gate's shadow a figure stepped forward, cloaked and hooded. But when the hood fell back for an instant, the face was a page torn from my childhood. The elder who had pressed the sigil into my palm, smiling as if duty justified everything. Her hand lifted, and in it a small ceremonial blade glinted with moonlight despite the burning sun. She said my name again, softer now, with the old liturgy braided beneath it. The rune at my wrist tightened as if to pull me forward. Tardus' shout cut through to me, his voice raw, pure. "Lyra!" My hand rose of its own accord. The blade felt suddenly heavy and holy and wrong in my grip. The air filled with smoke, the crack of wood breaking like distant thunder, and the world narrowed to the space between the elder's eyes and the man who had claimed me. I had been trained to kill him. I had been trained to obey. My arm trembled. The elder smiled, patient as a winter. The first strike had found its center.
The sky was a bruise the color of old battles when the first line of the order hit the walls. They came in a tide of riders with pale sigils, cloaked assassins slipping like knives, and acolytes beating drums that carried the cadence of oath and old rites. The fortress answered as if a beast had opened its mouth. I moved as if rehearsed by many lives. Shield up, blade slashing, breath counted between blows. Men I had scrubbed soup bowls for hours earlier were suddenly wolves with teeth. The beta was a blur at the wall, sending orders like stones across a river, and Tardus was a storm, a presence that smashed into the enemy until the air tasted of iron. The order had not come only with steel. They came with memory wrapped in cloth, ribbons burned with sigils, chants cut into the wind. Each time their drums beat, the rune under my sleeve throbbed like a living thing. Pain flared and I tasted blood though I had not been struck. Their rites were nets, trying to draw the oath up from the bones where it slept. I fought with what my body knew, slash, parry, push. But the oath's whisper rode every drumbeat. Fulfill. A cloaked figure slipped toward the medica. I moved like my training and slammed into the attacker, blade singing. The medica's eyes found mine. Thank you. And then she was gone, tending the wounded. Saving her steadied something human inside me. It proved I could choose who to protect. I saw Tardus cut through a line and then stumble as a bolt found his shoulder. He fell to one knee, roaring not in pain, but in stubborn fury. For a breath, the old training clawed forward. This was the moment the order had aimed for. The Alpha down, the Luna unsteady. The elder who had named me stepped through smoke with slow patience, token blade in hand. The pack closed like a wall. The beta shouted and men lined to hold ground while riders cut flanks and archers found their marks against black banners. Fires licked the stables and cries braided into an ugly hymn. My mind narrowed to muscle and will. Each move was both prayer and denial. Then the elder moved closer, her lips forming a syllable I had not heard spoken aloud in years. The sigil seared, my knees folded. Tardus twisted, red staining his sleeve as he pushed toward me, voice raw. "Lyra!" I saw his face, an island of grief and stubborn light, and the world narrowed to the space between his hand and the elder's blade. The oath screamed inside me, and for a beat it felt as if something in me reached for the only thing I had been taught to offer. I did not know which would move first, my hand to the blade or my body to his. The choice felt like the fault line of the world.
When the elder's blade flashed, time narrowed into the slit of a throat. Instinct and training moved before thought. My feet found footing, my hand closed on a hilt that knew its angles. But this time the hollowness the order had taught me to feel, cold, unshakable obedience, did not guide my hand. Something else did. The shape of Tardus's face, the way he'd wrapped a cloak about me, the steadiness in his voice that had held me when all my past wanted to snap me into place. "Lyra!" he bellowed. Not a command, a call. I answered it with everything that had once been meant for murder. I launched forward. The air smelled of smoke and copper and the iron tang of armor. The elder's chant wobbled as a man who chants while surprised. The syllables that had been designed to tug my oath into motion broke on the wind. I struck for the blade, for the wrist that held the token of my childhood. My blade met bone-stiff resistance. An acolyte leapt between us with a dagger, but my movement cleaved a new path. Steel sang, flesh met metal, and I felt the pack's rhythm around me, shouts, shields, the footfall of kin running to close the gap I had cut open. The elder stumbled, more from shock than from the cut I dealt. Blood and ritual ink smeared across her sleeve as her blade clattered to the stone. For a beat the world held, the drums stuttered, and something like a hush fell, not the hush of fear, but of recognition. I had not done what I was made to do. I had done what I chose to do. Tardus was at my side the instant after, his hand finding my shoulder, rough and grounding. "Stand," he said, low, and the single word felt like shelter. His other hand swept a man aside. His eyes were bright with a ferocity that made my heart both sharpen and ache. Around us, our people surged. Beta barking orders, archers finding their marks, shields forming a living wall. We were a tide thrown against the order's knives. I moved as Luna moves, less a sovereign than the body beside the one who carries the throne. I pulled a rider from his saddle, jammed a spear between two men who wanted to flank us. I ran to where a child crouched, handed up a broken shield and pushed them to safety. Each action was a proof in muscle. I was not the pawn they'd birthed me to be. I was a woman who chose who to save. The order countered with cunning. Their chants shifted, a lower tone meant to reach the places under skins where oaths sleep. My wrist flared like a bell struck with hot iron. Pain lanced, bright and silly-making. I tasted the old commands. Fulfill, fulfill, but now they sounded intrusive and foreign, as if someone else's language had been forced into my mouth. I clenched my jaw and did something the order never taught. I breathed into the pain and pushed it outward with purpose. I would not be directed by their ghosts. At one point the elder lunged again, slower now, wounded pride baking the movement. Tardus met her, and together we unmade the ritual she'd come to bind us with. He caught her wrist. I struck the ceremonial cord that tied the sigil to her garment, unraveling the knot she expected to tighten. The cord fell, and with it the neat cadence of their rites frayed. The pack's cry rose, not for a killing, but for victory. We drove them back in a sprawl of smoke and hoof and shouted names. Men took banners, women tended the fallen. The medica moved like a holy thing, binding, murmuring counterwords she had dared to learn. The tide turned. When the last of the cloaked figures fled into the scrub, exhausted cheers rose like rain. Tardus leaned on me for a moment, breath heaving, eyes wet and furious and proud. "You stood," he said, and there was no need for more. I should have felt triumph, clear, sharp, a blade's clean end. Instead, the rune under my sleeve began to thrum with a deeper, stranger music. It was no longer only pain, it was a counting in the bones, a slow tally that sounded like the ocean pulling back before it breaks. We had proved our loyalty. We had beaten back the Order's first wave. But as I sank to a broken step and let the medica press cooling herbs to my wrist, I heard the oath answering the world in its own cold voice. It did not forgive. It only kept its score.
The hunt that followed the morning's fire was not a charge so much as a slow, patient unmaking. We did not fling ourselves at crumbling walls and pray for victory. We peeled the Order apart like a skin, layer by layer, following the map their arrogance had left behind. Tardus sent riders to ring the border clans. The Beta traced supply lines and safe houses with a soldier's arithmetic. I walked through the places they had touched and felt, beneath each stone, the cold fingerprint of their work. We found temples carved out beneath a ruined chapel, rooms where the Order had stitched knots into cloth and iron. We found lists, names of men who died in accidents, ledger pages with dates and veiled instructions, tokens stamped with the pale sigil, and smuggled into pack councils like poison. The medica gathered the ritual cords and threw them into a brazier until the smoke tasted like a confession. The leather ledger we'd found in the library, once something neat and secret, was unrolled on a table in the great hall and set to the light, its pages like open wounds. The elders came with faces pale as pressed flowers. Some trembled and asked for mercy. Others closed their mouths in an old, brittle righteousness. We moved with the deliberate tenderness of people repairing a thing that had been broken. Tardus chose exposure over summary justice. He wanted the pack to see the mechanics of their deception, to feel the scale of what had been hidden. "If we merely kill them," he said, "the rot will learn to hide better. We must make this a lesson the land remembers." So we read. I watched as names tumbled out. Clan leaders purchased by whisper, markets rigged, lovers separated so kings would bend. Each name spooled the tale of a life remade by someone else's hand. The great hall changed as the ledger's pages turned, faces blank with disbelief, mouths that had once whispered now open into a communal grief, the children's eyes round with a dawning fear about the world grown on lies. When the elder who'd pressed the sigil into my palm was dragged in, less regal than memory, more human than the shadow that hovered in my dreams, she did not look at me at first. Her gaze slid across the hall like a needle seeking the right seam. Tardus stood and spoke without rage, his voice measured as an edge. He held out the ledger and the tokens and named plainly what the Order had done. Then he did something that surprised the murmur from our people. He put the elder's hands in mine. My fingers closed around hers like two old ropes. She smelled of tobacco and winter. Her mouth shaped a dozen practiced denials. Her eyes, for a flash, were not the blank steel I had imagined, but a human face that had learned to hide fear under doctrine. Some in the room hissed. Some wanted to drag her out to the yard and feed her to the wolves. Others, quieter, clutched their cloaks as if the cold had breached their bones. "You taught her," I said. The words were not accusation so much as the small, clean shape of the truth. "You taught me blades with the name of mercy on them." Silence hummed. The elder's lips trembled. Her apology was shapeless and old-fashioned, the kind of thing that will not undo a life. She spoke of balance and order, of a world better kept by harsh hands. I listened, and as I listened, I felt the room tilt toward a new hunger, to know how far the Order's reach had gone, and who among us had eaten from their table. We did not execute the elder that day. We bound her and set a guard. The pact demanded a reckoning, public confessions, reparations where possible, exile for those who had been willing agents. Many of the Order's acolytes fled into scraps of shadow. Others, stripped of their sigils and badges, knelt and bared names we had never thought to ask for. The Medica recited counterwords she'd learned from the exile the evening before. The cords smoked and the ritual markings were burned, one, by hands that shook. Victory tasted of ash and relief and a hard, uneasy pride. We had roasted their banners and torn their ledgers. We had found the hidden rooms where children had been taught how to love their own obedience more than mercy. The pack cheered in a ragged chorus that felt like rain after a drought. But as the last of the black ribbons flickered and fell into the grate, something in me answered in a way no one had measured. The rune beneath my sleeve pulsed, not with the knife's bright pain I'd felt in battle, but with a slow, gathering pressure that moved through my ribs like a tide pulling back before a storm. My hands grew heavy. The light around the brazier seemed to tilt into long lines. Tardus's voice reached me like something from a distance. "Lyra?" he said. His hand was at my elbow. I opened my mouth to tell him I was fine, that the Medica's herbs were taking hold, that the oath had finally ended because their leader had been unmade. But the answer the Order had bound into my blood did not care for logic. It remembered ancient promises kept in rooms like the ones we had burned. It counted the undoing and the balance and the cost. My knees gave the tiniest tremor. Something cold uncoiled down my spine. I braced with my hand on the table, ledger edges biting into my palm, and when I looked up, the hall blurred at the edges, as if someone had set a screen between me and the world. Tardus's hand closed around my wrist, not for protection this time, but as if to anchor me to the moment we had made. Behind him, the Medica's chant faltered. Around us, the pack's voices swallowed one another in triumph and confusion. The last of the Order's banners smoked. The ledger lay open to a page that named a town where a mother had been left a widow by a road accident. I tasted iron in the air, and something like the remembering of a vow. The triumph of the pack folded inward, and I felt the thin thread of my life tightening into a cord that threatened to break. "Lyra?" Tardus's voice was closer now, urgent. My vision went white at the edges. The ledger slipped from my fingers and hit the table. The sound was small and final. I could feel the oath answering the world.
The world narrowed to the pulse under my skin. The ledger fell from my fingers and the hall spun. A flash behind my eyes, then a cold that felt like hands tightening around my ribs. Tardus's grip closed on my wrist. The Medica pushed in, herbs clinking, voice a half-prayer. The pack's triumph became a distant tide. The sigil under my sleeve flared hotter than before, a white knot uncoiling beneath the skin. Pain was not a clean knife, but a slow burn, and breathing became climbing a flight I could not finish. "Hold her," Tardus said. He dragged my sleeve back. The Medica hissed and pressed cooling poultices to the mark. Her fingers trembled, though her motions were practiced. She mouthed counterwords she'd learned from exiles, small rites meant to dull the binding's edge, but the syllables skittered and did little against the oath's heat. "It's the oath," she said at last, blunt and tired. "Their binding answers. When they deliver an edict and the sigil recognizes it, the balance calls. It wants payment." Payment. The word landed like a verdict. I had been a child when they burned that knot into my palm. I had never thought my promise would require flesh. The idea of the Order keeping tally with blood hollowed my stomach. Tardus leaned close. His face was wet with sweat and a fierceness I had not seen until the walls trembled. "I will not let you pay them," he said, each word a small iron, "not by their hand." The Medica refused to stop her work. She pressed herbs to my temples, whispered a counter-liturgy, then looked at Tardus with the exhausted honesty of someone who knew too many rites. "We can slow it," she said. "We can buy hours, possibly, but some bindings demand what they were promised." The thought of owing blood made something cold and raw unfurl inside me. I tried to speak, to tell him not to carry me out into the night, not to give me over for sacrifice. My voice was a thin thread that snapped. Tardus's hand cupped my jaw, fingers warm and steady though they shook. "Then we choose how to face it," he said. "We choose." The effort to rise collapsed me, my knees folded, the world thinned to the sound of his breath. Without hesitation, he lifted me, his arms firm and quick. He carried me as a man carries a thing he refuses to lose, close to his heart, moving with the speed of someone who will not allow grief to slow him. I felt the motion, the press of his cloak, the rhythm of his steps. The hall blurred around us. Faces, torches, the medica's mutterings, reduced to a faint, distant chorus. My senses frayed, cold crept at the edges of my sight. The sigil pulsed once, then waited, patient as a beast. As Tardus moved toward the outer doors, his voice brushed my ear like a benediction. "Hold on," he said. "I will carry you to the tomb. I will not let them take you." His promise was a rope. For a breath I clung to it, then the world folded into shadow, and his name left my lips like a final prayer. Tardus.
I remember the weight of him most of all. Not the armor he wore into battle, but the body that bore me like a secret wrapped in flesh. Tardus moved through the fortress as if the stones themselves had bowed to make way, every footfall a decision. My ears filled with the rhythm of his breathing. Fast, ragged, a drum that tried to keep time with life. My vision was a smudge of torchlight, and his shoulder and the world narrowed to the press of his cloak against my face. I was half place, half dream. Pain and distance blurred. The medica's words were a rope dragged behind me. Once, I thought I heard the beta shout orders, felt the surge of people parting, felt hands lift and lower like waves. Then it was only Tardus, the arrogant man I hated, the steady hand I'd come to trust, the stranger who had stolen the right to be tender with me. He cussed under his breath in that low way he had when a plan went wrong, and the sound tore something in my chest that had nothing to do with breath. We left the bright, raw noise of the hall for silence. The corridors thinned to the hush that lives near tombs, a careful, respectful quiet. At the threshold to the ancestral tomb, the smell of smoke, rosewood, and old incense clung to the air. Moonlight bled through a narrow slit in the stone and found the raised slab where his family slept. It was polished smooth by hands that had come to grieve for generations, names carved into the surface like promises. Duskbane, 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 letters that trembled with history. He set me down as one sets a prayer. My limbs felt heavy as if made of some other material, obedience and revolt tangled together. Tardus crouched and lowered his face until the space between our foreheads was a sliver of breath. He tasted of iron and smoke and something I could not name. He did not speak at first. The sob that escaped him was a thing I had never been meant to hear, a sound made of loss and an animal's bewilderment. "Stay with me," he said, and the words were the smallest, most human thing I had ever known from him. He pressed his palm to the cold stone beside my cheek as if staking a claim that was also a plea. The contact made the rune under my sleeve flare, hot and insistent, and a fresh sharpness lanced my ribs. I swallowed the scream down until it turned into a whisper that lived behind my teeth. He began to speak then, names and histories tumbling out in a stream that seemed half prayer, half confession. "Forgive me, ancestors," he murmured. "Forgive me that I could not keep her from the debts not of her making. Forgive me if I am not enough." The words cracked on the last line. He cradled his face in his hands, and for a terrible, beautiful moment, his wolf-blooded posture went slack. The man beneath the title was shattered open. Tears fell. They splashed slow and bright on my temple, and a warmth threaded through my skin where they landed. I thought of the elder's hands at my wrist, the cold ceremony pressed into me, and now of this man who carried me to a stone that smelled of ancestors and salt. A part of him, the part that would have fought the world without thinking, broke in that motion. The shattering loosened something. It was not defeat, but the revealing of a love that had lived in the quiet places between commands. He pressed his forehead to the carved wolf above the tomb, and spoke so softly I could barely hear. Moon who sees. If she must go, let it be by my hand, and not by theirs. If the goddess will not lift her, let the pack remember she was ours. The plea was a thing offered in the dark, an offering from a man with grief bleeding from him. His shoulders trembled. He kissed my brow once, a brief, clumsy benediction, then sat back to watch me with the blank, aching stare of someone who has just lost a world and is not sure which one will come next. Outside, the wind moved through the courtyard, and every torch guttered a breath. The tomb seemed to listen. Tardus rose at last, slow as a tide turning, and took from his belt a small folded cloth, a family token I had seen him wear in quieter moments. He opened it with hands that shook and laid it over my chest, like a shield that could not keep the cold away. He knelt, hands braced on either side of the slab, and spoke a name I had never heard him use aloud, an invocation, not of war, but of pleading. The sound echoed off the stone and slipped into the night, thin and desperate. I thought the world would hold its breath forever. Something answered the darkness with a presence that stirred the hairs on my arm.
The stone under my cheek held the memory of 1,000 hands, hands of those who had come before, hands that had blessed, buried, judged. Tardus's breath shuddered against my hair. Each inhale was a small animal sob. The fortress beyond the tomb was a halo of distant sound, a world that had decided to continue without me. Here, on the cold slab, everything narrowed to the small universe of his grief. He spoke then, not in the clipped commands of a commander, but in the bare, ragged language of a man with no other shelter. It began with names, my name, his ancestors' names rolled out like a prayer bead. Then he smoothed his voice into something older. "Moon who watches us by stone and tide," he said, and his words trembled as if they had been forged in salt. "You who saw my father take an oath and my mother offer bread, see her now. She is not the one you were promised to be. She is yours if you must have her, or ours if you will give her back." His palm pressed to my forehead, warm, trembling, and he began to tell her a life as if that life could be bought back by being remembered aloud. He spoke of the kitchens where I had sweated at a cauldron, of the small kindnesses of a medica who hummed while she mended, of the ledger we burned and the names it freed. He admitted his failings, his moments of blindness, the times he had been slow. Each confession sounded like a barter, each apology a coin laid on an altar. I tried to answer him. Sound came, a small, stubborn rasp that felt like wind in brittle reeds. He kissed my brow and spoke faster, as if the faster he filled the air with plea, the less likely the world would take me. "If you are merciful, let her be forgiven. If you demand a price, take mine." He drew his thumb along the line of my jaw, and the motion was an oath in itself. "Take mine before you take hers." The moon leaned low, a soft silver scythe that pooled through the narrow slit in the tomb like an offering. The carved wolf above the slab seemed to drink that light and hold it. For the first time since the breath had left me, I felt the world tilt, not toward pain but toward listening. There was a hush so complete that the rattling of distant armor sounded sacrilegious. Something moved in the hush. Not a footfall, but a bending of the air, like a tide pulling itself up the shore. The candles along the alcove guttered and then steadied. Dust motes turned as though a slow hand had scooped them into a bowl. Tardus' voice lowered to a single strangled word. "Mother." I felt it before I knew what to call it. A small warmth against my temple, like a fingertip of light. The rune under my sleeve pulsed, not with the old white-hot pain, but with a thin, curious hum. The pressure that had been tightening inside my chest eased its tightening just a fraction, then set again, as if something had taken a measurement and decided to wait. A sound brushed my ear, not a voice I could place, but a resonance. A bell struck at the bottom of the sea. It threaded through the hollows of my memory and untied things I had held tight. Lullabies murmured by the elder in another life, the scent of smoke mixed with lavender, a child's laugh folded into the fold of a page. For a blink the world made sense in a new grammar. Tardus's shoulders sagged as if relief had passed through him, but his face did not ease completely. He lifted his head slowly, eyes searching the moonlit air as if trying to read an answer in its drift. His hand trembled on my wrist. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. My fingers, one small, stubborn finger, twitched. The motion was barely a thing, a reed in a slow wind, but it was movement. Tardus's head snapped down and his breath hitched like a struck animal. The hush broke then, soft, like a held thing deciding to breathe, and the moon seemed to thicken, drawing the thin silver of the world toward it. A single mote of light drifted from the carved wolf and hovered above my chest, luminous and patient, as if weighing the balance the elder had once demanded. It hovered, and the world waited with it.